Hello and welcome back to the second in our Friday flower talk. This week we're looking at the principles of design and how they relate to the elements of designs that we spoke about last week. It's been a really busy week. We haven't had chance, unfortunately, to upload a Wednesday video, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to fit in this Friday flower talk before the rest of the week gets too busy. It is the week leading up to Valentine's Day, and as a commercial florist, it's probably one of the busiest weeks of the year for us. So I've spent most of the day cutting and conditioning fresh flowers ready for us to use over the next couple of days. So the principles of design, they are balance, scale and proportion, closely related to one another but different in their definition, rhythm, contrast, dominance and harmony. And when I explain them and talk through each one, you will understand how they relate to the elements that we spoke about last week and how we sort of connect it all together to create a good floral design. Now, the first one I'm talking about is balance. And for me, as a commercial florist and a flower arranger, balance, I think, is probably one of the most important factors that we need to consider. And I'm talking about actual balance. There are two types of balance used in flower arranging and floristry. And balance is, we can have actual balance, so that's whether or not your design is stable. And then we have visual balance, which is how it looks to your eye. So whether or not you have an outline shape that is symmetrically balanced or asymmetric, whether you have an even balance of your colours and your flower varieties. And first off, we're going to look at actual balance. And as it describes, it's whether or not your design is actually balanced, whether it's stable, whether it tips and rocks back and forth, or whether it leans to the left or leans to the right. It's a very important principle of design to remember. And if you have a tall container, maybe a pedestal in a church, sometimes the floor is a little bit uneven. You might get tiles or stonework that it's standing on top of. So actual balance in a tall container is really very important, because the minute we add weight onto the top of, whether it's a wrought iron stand in a church or a thin glass vase or a beautiful, elegant container, the minute we add weight on the top of it, it can create the design and the overall flower arrangement to become unstable. The taller the container is, the more difficult this problem appears. If your container is flat or hasn't a great deal of depth to it, then the problem isn't so evident. And as a commercial florist, it's one that we have to be quite aware of when we're delivering flowers, because if we create a design that will be top heavy during the delivery, it will rock back and forth in the van, it'll tip forward, tip over, and then it will damage the flower material that's inside. So we create actual balance by having an even distribution of the flowers in the design, remembering to always bring flowers and foliage to the back of your arrangement as well, so we bring equal actual weight to the back. If we add all the flowers in at the front, then it becomes unstable and can tip forward. So remembering actual balance when you start arranging in tall containers, as it's really quite important. Then we have something called visual balance, and again, as it says, it's about the visual look of a design. Now we can have asymmetric balance, whereas the design is equal on both sides. If you can imagine drawing a line down the middle of your arrangement, so almost a vertical axle, and then you look to the left and to the right, visual balance will make it equal on both sides. Or you have unsymmetrical balance, or asymmetrical balance probably would be the correct word to use. You have asymmetrical balance, which makes it unbalanced. So we're getting our A's and our N's mixed up a little bit. So asymmetric balance is when your design looks like it's longer on one side than the other, although it would still be stable, so you would still have actual balance. So you'd need to make sure that from the top to the bottom, or from the left to the right, or from the front to the back is visually balanced. And we do that by colour or flower materials, using line correctly, using the distribution of flowers correctly. So the visual balance links really well with the elements that we looked at last week. So we need good visual balance between our shapes and our forms that we discussed last week. We need good balance between our textures, because too many textures is very fussy and very busy. Then there is something called dynamic balance, which is often used in contemporary or modern floral design. It's often related to sculpture and art, and quite often it's the very opposites balancing one another off. So you might have a large round leaf that is maybe very busy or very heavily patterned, and that might be balanced by a very long branching twisted piece of willow or hazel. So they're not identical in their balance, but it creates this dynamic effect, this very interesting form of balance. So visually it looks like it's balanced, but the materials are often very different. Then we have something called static balance, and static balance is something that we probably don't want to create within a design, because it means that your eye doesn't freely move through the arrangement. It means that the placements of your flowers are very stagnant and very stiff on either side of the arrangement. And rather than having this lovely visual line of materials flowing through the arrangement, you have almost symmetrical placement of your flowers, almost identical on either side, which you might think in flower arranging is the right way to do it, because you like to have things matching on either side, but it makes the design just very unnatural looking, very stiff, very stagnant, and what we refer to as static, very static. Then you have something called balance by placement. This is often used in flower arranging competitions. It's not very often used in floristry. It's used a lot in interpretive work, exhibitions and competition work. And it's when you might have an arrangement that is balanced by maybe another object. So a figurine or a gift sometimes in floristry. It might be an interpretive design where you have an accessory that complements and tells a story, and the placement of that accessory balances with the flower arrangement. And when you remove that accessory, so you remove the figurine or whatever it happens to be, then your design itself looks unbalanced and unfinished. So that would be balance by placement. Far more popular in flower arranging than floristry. It might be that your design needs a heavy base. You might want to include slate or a cork base to it. Again, sometimes in floristry, if it's a wedding arrangement, we might have scattered petals on the base to make your eye travel downwards to aid better balance. But it's definitely something that's used far more in flower arranging than commercial floristry. If we think about static arrangements, then there is little movement. It's very uninteresting. It's almost fixed in a position, quite stiff, very, very formal, less rhythm and less movement. Whereas I often think about dynamic balance as almost something like counterbalanced or cantilever. You almost look at the design and it's intriguing and interesting because you don't know how it's physically balanced, because it is very unnatural in its appearance. It can be quite energetic. It has lots of personality and impact, I always think. So the two most important ones are actual and visual balance. Then we have dynamic balance, static balance, and balance by placement. Then we're going to move on to scale, and scale relates to the size of each individual component. So the size in relation to one flower to another and in relation to its container. And size relation is important in competition work in flower arranging if you're working on designs like petites and miniatures, or if you're working on something that's very large. you'd need to consider any accessories or bows or anything you add to that flower arrangement is within scale of the rest of your design. There's nothing worse than seeing a gorgeous flower arrangement and then it's overpowered by a large bow or a large accessory. Maybe in flower arranging you've got a large figurine that just doesn't complement the design at all. So scale is really very important. It's important that you have flowers that are similar in size and shape because it makes your eye travel through the design more effectively. If you have a very small, delicate, maybe a lily of the valley, and then you have it alongside a huge piece of hydrangea, the scale is very much jarring against one another. You need to have things that move from a tiny little bud to a half opening flower to the full flower. And that's often why I encourage you to use smaller flowers on the outside, move into the larger flower in the middle, because it aids your scale of your overall flower arrangement and stops your eye jumping around and not really knowing where to follow on in the design. Scale is also very important in large buildings. You'd need to consider having larger flowers, larger containers, a larger design if you were placing something in a very large building. Whereas if it was maybe a small living room in somebody's home, then you would obviously need to scale that back and think of something that was more in keeping with the home environment. Then we move on to proportion, and scale and proportion are often referred to in the same sort of description, but proportion relates to the quantity and the measurements and the area within the flower arrangement, whereas scale relates to the size of the flower heads. I wouldn't get too sort of hung up on it at the moment, as long as you understand that there needs to be scale and proportion within your design. Differentiating between the two becomes more evident as you work your way through more designs and you get more competent in what you're creating. So proportion is important in relation to the size of your container, the width of your design, flowers to foliage. So we need to generally, in traditional flower arranging, you often will have more flowers in proportion to the foliage. It's not a right or a wrong. We love foliage. Lots of flower arrangers would just use foliage alone. But you need to consider how the proportions work together, how the proportions relate to the colour that we talked about last week when we looked at the elements of design. Do you have equal proportions of your different colours? If you're using maybe 3 colours, often you have a proportion of one flower that is more dominant than the other 2, because again it makes the design more pleasing to the eye. Your more dominant flower is often the focal flower and the one that your eye sees first. Now in flower arranging we tend to use the rule of 3s, so you would have your proportions 1/3 to 2/3, your container would be the 1/3 and your flower arrangement itself would be the 2/3. That added up together makes your 3, so that's where the rule of 3s are applied. And if you're a competition addict and you enjoy entering competitions and you get an area of space to work within, then you generally leave 1/3 of that space free. So again, we're looking at the 2/3 for your flower arrangement and then some space within the design, or around the design I should say, being the 1/3, so that your proportional space within the area is filled appropriately and we don't overfill the exhibition space that you use. And this is another one that I quite often link to shop window displays. If you're looking at very professionally done shop windows, and I often relate this to places like Harrods or Harvey Nichols, Debenhams, the sort of large shops, you won't have the full window filled with designs and accessories and things and items that they're selling within that shop. You will have a proportion of the window which concentrates very much on the product that they're trying to sell. So it might be a lady's winter coat. Alongside it there will be the matching handbag and the boots to go with it, maybe a hat and a scarf, but there won't be everything else around it cluttering up the proportions within the window. So there will be a proportional space in that window that is empty. And again, that relates to the space that we talked about last week. So consider even proportions with your sizes, your quantities and the area or the space that you're working within. And then we look at rhythm and repetition, and you'll hear me talk a lot about rhythm as I'm discussing and explaining the flower arrangement. And the rhythm is almost the visual activity. It's like the movement of the flowers and foliage throughout the design. And we create this by using the shape and forms, the lines and the colour and space that we talked about last week in the elements of design. And the visual movement or the rhythm is created by repeating the shapes or the line or the colour of the elements that we talked about last week. So we repeat colour, or we might use a graduation in size and shape of our flowers. So again, you go from a bud to a half open flower to a fully open flower. We radiate our stems in traditional flower arranging and floristry from a focal point. So the radiation of the stems is almost like the rays of the sun or the spokes of a wheel on a bike, or I always think about those big wagon wheels that you used to see in the old westerns, where all the lines head towards a centre point in the middle. Your flower arrangement stems need to look like they're all coming from a centre point, and that's what makes the rhythm. It makes your eye move up and down and into the focal point and back out in another direction. So it's direction of line, it's the radiation of materials, it's the transitional material, or it's the transition of a small flower or a small bud opening into a larger size head. Without rhythm, we tend to have designs that are very stagnant, very stiff and static, almost lifeless with no movement within them. And if you go back to last week and you think about line, movement can be created with curved lines and curved branches, or straight stems and straight branches. We repeat the shapes, we repeat lines, and we repeat the colours, which is last week's elements of design. We get the repetition of colour, so we repeat the colour again, so your eye follows a continuous line, and those lines can be imaginary, they can be implied, they can be a literal line, they can be a line that's maybe an ivy leaf that's drooping forward and it's staggered because the leaves are intermittent down through that stem, but it's almost like a pathway that makes your eye move. And if you think about a path in your garden that leads maybe from the back door to the end of your garden, that is a visual line that creates rhythm. So rhythm and repetition in floral design. Then we have contrast, and again you'll hear me talk a lot about contrast, and contrast is about emphasising the difference. So the opposites, the difference, a contradiction, almost a variation in the textures, a variation in the colour, and a variation in the line, shape and form. So again, if you think about all those elements we discussed last week, contrasting them makes a more interesting design, a more interesting, exciting design to look at. Without contrasts, your design is almost very flat and uninteresting. Too much contrast and your design becomes very busy and has nowhere for your eye to stop and your eye to rest. So contrasts, they can be, as I said, in the shapes, the textures, the colours, Your line can be vertical or your line can be horizontal. Your line can radiate out from a centre point, and it can be diagonal within a design as well. It could be the contrast between light and dark, or the shades of your foliage. In traditional flower arranging, I think that, you know, lots of these geometric shapes that I've been talking about over the last couple of months, contrast in traditional work is often quite subtle, whereas contrast in modern designs, again often inspired by paintings or sculpture, the contrast is often far more dynamic and far more exciting and interesting. You might have two contrasting colours from the colour wheel, or you could have two very interesting textured materials alongside one another, or a very textured container that contrasts against the smooth lines of the foliage that you've used. For me, contrast adds impact and a richness to your design, but be careful that you don't overdo and complicate with too much contrast. Then we're going to come on to dominance, and dominance is often looked at as a focal point. And again, you'll hear me talk about a focal point. You'll hear about me explaining that your lines and your repetition of shapes and colours and patterns should lead you to the focal point. And in traditional flower arranging, your traditional focal point is about 2/3 of the way from the top down. In more modern flower arranging or parallel style arranging, contemporary work, you can have more than one dominant point, more than one focal point. And last week, when you think about the elements of design, again, they all lead your eye to the focal area, the more dominant section within your design. Same thing happens with the graduation of your stems. As they get bigger, they lead you to the focal point. Now, the focal point ideally needs to be very calming and very resting. It allows your brain and your eye to stop and rest and appreciate everything it's seen before it moves off in another direction to find something else interesting to look at. And that is often why you see me use something like a flat ivy leaf or a begonia leaf around or in the area of the focal flower, because it helps aid that calming influence to the design. And then the final one we're looking at, and quite often this is the hardest one for people to understand, and it's called harmony, and it's the unity of all of the principles and elements used together to create a pleasing overall oneness to your design. It's about making sure everything works together with one another, and it's really achieved by good use of your principles and elements of design. Some people think that harmony relates to harmony, your colour harmonies, but it's the overall theme or style, almost how your design links together, how you get a pleasing look of all the components within the design. I often relate this to fashion or home interior, and I quite often relate it to twin set and pearls. If you're going out in a very neat twin set with your pearls, then you're not going to put some heavy biker boots to go with it, or some maybe heavy 1980s earrings. You're going to style your outfit to coordinate and harmonise with all your accessories. And then again, maybe if we think about interior design and you have quite a traditional living room, maybe for argument's sake, you're not likely to suddenly have a very contemporary light or a very contemporary mat or table to go with it. You're trying to choose everything that all follows along the same theme and the same sort of style. And I think harmony we do naturally when you're dressing yourself or you're decorating at home, whether you're buying a present for somebody. Quite often you will look for wrapping paper and a card that might match the theme of the present that you're buying. Again, it's one that's very important in competition work. If you've created an arrangement that has maybe a Georgian inspired arrangement, then you're not going to suddenly add in a 2020 style container or something from the 80s. You're going to stay very much within the period of the Georgian era. So harmony, it's how everything unites. It's the overall oneness. It's how we bring all the principles and elements design together to create an interesting flower arrangement. So I hope that's helped with a little bit of an understanding over the principles and elements of design. What I possibly might do next is compare two arrangements alongside one another and discuss through the principles and elements with you. Don't forget, if you have any questions, just send them to me at sharondower@hotmail.com. Put in the subject box that it's a Friday Flower Talk question, and I'm going to collate all these questions together to answer them in one of our Friday night talks. So have a great weekend. I hope you've enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing you again when the madness of St. Valentine's Day is over. Bye for now, everyone.